I've been setting aside money every single paycheck for 4 years. Not for a trip, not for a car, not for the renovation my husband kept circling back to whenever we walked past a home improvement store. Every extra dollar went into an account I'd named simply Mom and Dad. My parents had been married for 49 years when my father got the diagnosis. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but enough to make the stairs in their split level in Sudbury feel like a negotiation every single morning. My mother called me one Tuesday in February, not to complain, she never complained, but I could hear it in the pauses between her sentences. The way she said, "Your father managed fine," with just a half-second of hesitation before managed. That was when I made up my mind entirely. My name is Katelyn Fowler. I'm 34 years old. I work as a registered nurse at a mid-sized hospital outside of Toronto, and before anyone does the math and raises an eyebrow, I'll explain. My husband, Ryan, and I bought our home 6 years ago when prices in our area were still manageable, before everything went sideways. We don't have children yet. For 3 of the past 4 years, I picked up every extra shift the scheduling coordinator would give me. Weekends, statutory holidays, overnight stretches that left me driving home at 6 in the morning squinting at the sunrise. Ryan never once complained. He made dinner on the nights I came home, too tired to stand at the stove, and he quietly moved his gym equipment into the garage so I could use the spare room as a proper office for the occasional telehealth contract work I took on the side. Between my savings, the extra shifts, a small inheritance I received when my aunt passed 3 years ago, $22,000 I never touched, and a TFSA I'd been maxing out since my late 20s, I had just over $380,000 sitting in accounts by the time I started seriously looking at properties. My parents didn't need anything sprawling or elaborate. What they needed was single-story accessible, something without the stairs that were quietly winning the argument against my father's hip every morning. Ideally somewhere closer to me. The listing I found in late spring last year was a 3-bedroom bungalow in a quiet neighborhood in Barrie. 40 minutes from my door, 15 minutes from a good hospital, with a finished basement Ryan could eventually use when we visited for long weekends, and a backyard that backed onto a green belt so my mother could finally have a proper garden. Listed at $365,000. I put in the offer the same afternoon I toured it. I told my brother James, who lives out in Edmonton, and was immediately furious that I hadn't looped him in sooner, then immediately supportive when I pointed out there wasn't time. He flew in to help with the logistics and kept the secret from our parents for 8 weeks, which I genuinely believe was harder on him than the actual move itself. The plan was straightforward. My parents' 50th anniversary was on a Sunday in late September. I'd arranged for them to drive down from Sudbury the Saturday before, telling them we were taking them out for an anniversary dinner and that they'd stay the weekend with Ryan and me. Ryan's parents, his mother Lynette and his stepfather, Don, lived 20 minutes away and had offered almost immediately, almost too eagerly, to help us get the new house ready while Ryan and I went to pick up my parents from the hotel where we'd booked them for Friday night. That part, the eagerness, I should have registered differently. Lynette is the kind of person who has an opinion about everything you do and frames it as concern. She made a comment once, early in our marriage, that I was the kind of woman who was always rushing somewhere, and the way she said it made clear she didn't mean it as a compliment. She'd made remarks about my parents over the years. Small things. The kind you almost can't repeat out loud because they sound minor in isolation, but that stack up quietly into something unmistakable. A comment about how my mother must have been overwhelmed raising children on a teacher's salary. A reference to my father's early retirement as if it were a euphemism for something shameful rather than a forced exit after a back injury at 57. 6 years of those comments, and I had absorbed every one of them because Ryan always said he'd speak to her, and because I genuinely believed, that a gift I was giving my own parents with my own money had nothing whatsoever to do with Lynette. I was wrong about that in a way that I am still, even now, working out exactly how to feel about. We picked up my mom and dad on Saturday morning. My mother had worn her anniversary blouse, the pale green one she saves for occasions, and my father had put on the blazer he'd bought for my cousin's wedding 8 years ago and maintained with the specific care he applies to anything he intends to keep a long time. They thought we were heading to Ryan's parents' house first, then on to dinner somewhere nice. My mother held my hand in the back seat and asked if the restaurant had a fish option, because my father was watching his cholesterol. My father told her to stop worrying. She said she wasn't worrying. They had that same argument they've been having for 30 years, with the same amount of warmth in it that they've always had. I had to keep my eyes on the road so she wouldn't see my face. When we turned onto the street in Barrie, I noticed the curtains in the front window moving before we'd even pulled into the driveway. The welcome banner I'd ordered, a simple thing, cream-colored with their names and the date on it, was nowhere visible on the front door. The potted mums I'd asked Lynette and Dawn to place on either side of the front steps were not there. Instead, there was a large decorative sign I'd never seen before, leaning against the railing that said, in that rustic farmhouse script that's been on everything for the past decade, "Home is where the heart is." It wasn't mine. My mother stepped out of the car first, the way she always does, reaching back for my father's hand. She'd taken 3 steps up the front walk before the door opened. Lynette was standing in the doorway. She looked at my mother with an expression I can only describe as territorial. The specific look of someone who has decided, before any conversation has taken place, where the boundary is going to fall. And then she pointed, one finger extended in a gesture that I don't think she meant to be as aggressive as it was, and she said, loud enough that I heard it clearly from behind the car door, "This isn't really a good time. We're still getting settled." My mother stopped walking. She looked at Lynette. She looked at the house. She looked back at me with an expression I have never in my life seen on her face and hope to never see again. A combination of confusion and a specific kind of embarrassment that came, I think, from believing she had somehow intruded on something private. "I'm so sorry," my mother said. She actually apologized. She took a step backward. My father had gone very still. He has a way of doing that, not rigid, not visibly angry, just very, very still, the way he gets when he's trying to understand something and the pieces aren't adding up, and he doesn't want to make a mistake. His hand found my mother's elbow. I had not said a single word. I was still standing at the rear of the car, keys in my hand, watching my mother apologize on the front walk of a house with her name on the title. Lynette looked over my mother's shoulder and saw me. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite surprise. It was the look of a person who has been caught mid-sentence, who needs a beat to shift the story they're currently telling. She composed herself almost immediately, the way she always does, and said, "Katelyn, we weren't expecting you quite yet. Dawn is just finishing up with a few things inside." "What things?" I said. "We brought some pieces over," she said, "just to help fill the space. It felt bare." "What pieces?" She gestured vaguely in a way that was supposed to communicate generosity and instead communicated something else entirely. "Just some things from the storage unit. A lamp. The armchair from the den. Some boxes from Dawn's office that we were going to sort through anyway. We thought, since the house needs furnishing, the house doesn't need furnishing," I said. "I furnished it." There was a pause. "There wasn't much in there when we arrived," she said, and her tone had shifted slightly. Slightly more patient. "The way you talk to someone you've decided isn't quite following along. We were just trying to help get things ready." I walked past her into the house. What I found was not a few things. In the living room, the lamp I'd selected and had delivered 2 weeks prior had been moved to the corner and replaced with a large floor lamp I recognized from Lynette's storage. The armchair she'd mentioned was positioned in front of the window, where I'd placed the reading chair I'd bought my mother specifically because it had the right lumbar support for her back. In the kitchen, Dawn's boxes were stacked along the wall near the pantry. Down the hall, the door to the second bedroom, the one I'd set up for my parents' use as a craft room for my mother, who paints watercolors, was open, and inside were stacked storage totes and a folding table that hadn't been there 2 days ago. Dawn appeared from the hallway, holding a box, and had the grace at least to look genuinely uncomfortable. He set the box down without speaking and took a step back. Ryan pulled into the driveway a few minutes behind us, having taken a second car with James and the last of the dinner set up. I heard him come through the front door, heard his footsteps stop in the living room. Then I heard him say quietly, "Mum, what is all this?" "We were making it feel like a home," Lynette said. She'd followed me inside by then. "You said eventually you wanted a place in this area for the family. I thought this was going in that direction." "Dawn and I were only trying to get it ready." "I never said anything like that," Ryan said. "You mentioned wanting something closer to Barrie. I mentioned that in passing 2 years ago." His voice was level. He looked at me. I was standing near the kitchen doorway, and he looked at me the way you look at someone when you're doing a damage assessment and you want them to know you're on their side before you say anything out loud. Then he looked at his mother. "Whose name is on the title for this house?" he asked. She didn't answer. "Mum, Katelyn's," she said, quieter. So this isn't a family property. It isn't an investment for anyone. It's my wife's gift to her parents, who are currently standing outside on the front walk because you told them it wasn't a good time. He paused. Do you understand what you actually did? She started to say something about intentions, and he held up one hand. Don, Ryan said, turning to his stepfather, did you know whose house this was when you started bringing things in? Don looked at the floor. He nodded once, slowly, and that single nod clarified something I had been trying to talk myself out of believing for 2 days. This had not been a misunderstanding. It had not been enthusiasm that outran communication. Lynette had known. Don had known. They had looked at the address Ryan had given them for the setup, and somewhere between that moment and the arrival of their storage unit's armchair, they had made a decision. That the house my money had bought was somehow, eventually, logically, inevitably, part of a larger Fowler family picture that my parents had no natural place in. It was the same logic that had produced 6 years of small comments. The same logic that made my mother's teacher's salary a footnote and my father's injury a vague embarrassment. The same logic that had Lynette standing in a doorway telling my mother, on what was supposed to be the best afternoon of her life, that it wasn't a good time. I went back outside. My mother was sitting on the front step. She had sat down, I think because her legs felt unreliable, which is something that happens to her when she's overwhelmed and trying not to show it. My father was standing just behind her with one hand on her shoulder, and the expression on his face was the one I'd only ever seen once before, when he got the call about his own father passing. Not anger. Something quieter than anger and harder to watch. I sat down next to my mum. I owe you an explanation, I said. And an apology for how this started. She looked at me. This is your house, I said, yours and Dad's. I bought it for your anniversary. Your name is on the deed, both of yours. She didn't say anything for a long moment. My father's hand tightened on her shoulder. What? She said finally, very quietly. I've been saving for 4 years. The house is paid for. It's accessible, it's single-story, it's got a garden in the back that gets afternoon sun. James helped with the logistics from Edmonton. We were going to surprise you at dinner tonight. My mother put both hands over her mouth. My father sat down on the step on her other side, slowly, carefully, the way he does everything now, and stared at the front door for a long time without speaking. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were wet, which I have seen exactly 3 times in my entire life. Katelyn, he said. Just my name. And then he couldn't say anything else, and he didn't need to. Inside, Ryan and James were methodically carrying Lynette's things back out to her car. I heard the sound of boxes being lifted, furniture being shifted, Don offering to help, and being quietly and firmly directed to carry his own boxes, rather than be thanked for them. Lynette did not speak much during this process. At one point, I heard her say something to Ryan about only wanting to make sure there was enough for everyone, and I heard him respond in a voice I'd never quite heard him use with her before. Not cruel, not loud, simply final. This was never part of your plan to make, he said. Katelyn built this for her parents. That's the whole story. She and Don were gone within half an hour. The silence after their car left was entirely different from the silence that had settled over the front walk when my mother had apologized on someone else's porch. This silence felt like something being set down after a long carry. James had found the welcome banner in the coat closet. Lynette had moved it there, presumably to store one of her lamps, and he rehung it on the front door while I walked my parents through the house. I showed my mother the second bedroom and what I'd intended it for. I'd left her favorite brand of watercolor paper on the desk, because it was the kind of detail that either lands completely or seems ridiculous, and when she saw it, she laughed and cried at the same time, which I have learned is her highest register of emotion. My father spent a long time in the backyard, just walking around it slowly, touching the fence at the back where the green belt started, looking at the garden beds I'd had turned over and prepped for spring planting. He didn't say much. He's always processed the things that matter most by moving quietly through them. We had dinner that evening around the kitchen table, the actual table, my parents' old one, which James had arranged to have transported from Sudbury as part of the surprise, so the first meal in their new house would be at the same table they'd sat at for 30 years. Ryan cooked. James told the story of trying to coordinate the table logistics from Edmonton while pretending to my parents that he had no idea what was happening, and my father laughed in the way he laughs when something genuinely catches him off guard. A real laugh, the kind I hadn't heard quite enough of in recent years. My mother cried again after dinner, but it was the kind of crying that comes when something you've been carrying for a very long time is finally put down somewhere safe. She stood at the back window, looking out at the garden in the dark for a while, and then she said, not to anyone in particular, just to the room, "I never thought we'd have a garden." She'd grown vegetables in containers on the porch in Sudbury for 15 years because there was no yard. I hadn't known, until that moment, that she'd stopped thinking of a real garden as something that would ever be possible. My father came and stood behind her and put his hand on the back of her neck the way he's done for as long as I've known them, and the two of them just looked out the window together. 49 years of doing everything carefully, spending thoughtfully, never asking for more than what the situation allowed, and giving the remainder to everyone around them. A bungalow in Barrie with afternoon sun in the garden and a green belt at the back fence and no stairs to negotiate in the morning. It wasn't repayment. You don't repay something like that, but it was the closest thing I could build with what I had, and this time no one was going to tell them it wasn't a good time.